It was one of those nights where the rain seemed to have a personality of its own, relentless and heavy. I was exhausted from the long day, my body aching for sleep. As I drove through the quiet residential streets, the rhythmic sound of rain tapping on the windshield became almost hypnotic. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want anything but the peace of silence. The streets were empty, except for her. A girl was walking alone, soaked to the skin, with her hair sticking to her face. No umbrella, no coat. She looked like she'd been out in the rain for hours. My first instinct was to keep driving, pretend I hadn't seen her, but something gnawed at me, pulling at my conscience. I slowed the car and rolled down the window, the rain pattering on the doorframe. "Hey!" I called out. "Do you need a ride?" She stopped and turned her head slowly toward me. Her face was pale, her hair matted against her cheeks. Without a word, she opened the back door and slid into the seat behind me, water dripping onto the fabric. "Where are you headed?" I asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. "To the end of the road," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, though something about her tone unsettled me. The end of the road wasn't far, just a dead end, and beyond that, nothing but woods. We drove in silence, the air in the car growing colder. Every few minutes, I stole glances at her in the rearview mirror. She just sat there, staring out of the window, not moving, her wet clothes dripping onto the seat. When we reached the stop sign near the dead end, I asked, "Is it past here?" There was no answer. I glanced back at her, but my heart froze. The back seat was empty. She was gone. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the car, frantically looking around. There was no sign of her, no sound of footsteps. The back seat where she had been sitting was completely dry. It was as if she had never been there. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Just beyond the road, through the rain and mist, stood a cemetery, the iron gates barely visible in the gloom. "The end of the road," I whispered to myself. I got back into my car, my hands shaking, and sped away, the rain blurring my vision. I didn't look back. It was a chilly October evening when my friends and I decided to visit a local haunted corn maze. We had heard rumors that it was one of the best in the area, known for its terrifying actors and elaborate set pieces. The place was tucked away on a sprawling farm, the maze surrounded by endless fields of corn that stretched up into the darkness. There was a strange tension in the air as we stood in line. I overheard a group of teenagers talking about something that had happened the previous year. How the maze had been shut down for a night after one of the workers supposedly attacked a visitor. No one knew for sure what had happened, but it was enough to give the place a reputation. Once we were inside, the maze seemed normal enough at first. The path twisted and turned, with the occasional actor jumping out from behind a corner, their screams blending with the eerie sound effects playing from hidden speakers. The deeper we went, the more disoriented we became, the tall stalks of corn closing in on us, blocking out the moonlight. Eventually, we came to a fork in the path. To the left, a sign read, "This way to safety." To the right, a sign warned, "Danger, keep out." Naturally, we split up. Two of my friends took the safe route, while I, along with my buddy Carl, headed down the danger path. We expected it to be the scarier option, and we weren't wrong. The air felt colder as we walked, and the corn seemed to press in even tighter. We turned a corner and came face to face with a man in a black costume, his face hidden behind a white mask. He didn't jump or scream. He just stood there, holding a pumpkin. "Take it," he said, his voice low and raspy. I laughed, thinking it was part of the act, but the man didn't move. He just held the pumpkin out toward me. "Take it," he repeated, this time more forcefully. I hesitated, but something about his voice, the intensity in his posture, made my skin crawl. I took the pumpkin from him, and without another word, he turned and disappeared into the corn. Carl and I continued on, the pumpkin heavy in my hands. The further we walked, the stranger the maze became. The usual decorations and jump scares were gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. Eventually, we met up with the others at the point where the two paths converged. "What's with the pumpkin?" one of them asked, laughing. I explained what had happened, but none of them seemed concerned. It wasn't until we were almost out of the maze that things took a darker turn. One of the actors approached me, breaking character. "You're not supposed to have that," he said, pointing at the pumpkin. I told him one of the workers had given it to me, but he just shook his head. "There's no one working in a black costume," he said, looking genuinely confused. As we made our way out of the maze, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When we finally reached the exit, I opened the pumpkin, expecting it to be filled with some kind of prop or prank. Inside were human fingers. Last October, a group of us decided to visit the infamous Oak Hill Haunted Corn Maze. It was an annual tradition, one we looked forward to every fall. The maze had earned a reputation over the years for being particularly terrifying, and there was something thrilling about walking through it at night, the cold wind rustling the stalks of corn. We arrived just after sunset, the sky tinged with the last hints of daylight. As we waited in line, a rumor spread through the crowd that someone had been injured in the maze the previous year. Supposedly, one of the actors had gone too far, scaring someone so badly that they had a heart attack. No one could confirm if it was true, but it added to the tension as we finally made our way inside. The maze was a winding, twisting labyrinth of paths, some of which seemed to lead nowhere. The air was filled with the sound of distant screams, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. Actors in elaborate costumes jumped out at us from hidden corners, their faces painted with grotesque makeup. But as the night went on, the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. At one point, we came to a dead end, where a man dressed in an old-fashioned suit stood silently. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just stared at us with cold, unblinking eyes. We tried to laugh it off, but there was something unnerving about him, something that made my stomach churn. We quickly turned back, but from that moment on, the maze felt different. The actors were no longer jumping out at us, they were following us. No matter which path we took, we could feel their presence, lurking just out of sight. The sound of their footsteps seemed to echo in the distance, growing closer with every turn. When we finally made it to the exit, I looked back one last time, expecting to see the man in the suit. But the path was empty, and the actors had vanished. Later I learned that no one had been assigned to that part of the maze that night. No one had been dressed in a suit. The woods behind my house were always thick with shadows, even during the day. The trees grew so close together that sunlight barely touched the ground, and the deeper you went, the quieter everything became. As kids, my friends and I used to play hide and seek out there, but even then, we all knew something was off about that place. There was an unspoken rule. You never went too far into the woods. Years passed, and those childhood games turned into something darker. One autumn night, after a few drinks around the fire, my friends and I dared each other to explore the woods again. It was a typical teenage challenge, but there was a seriousness in the air that we couldn't shake. "Let's go to the old cabin," Carl suggested, his voice daring but his eyes betraying the fear he was trying to hide. The cabin was a decrepit old shack deep in the forest, one we had always avoided as kids. Stories about it floated around the neighborhood, how it was once owned by a hermit who had disappeared without a trace, or how a group of kids had gone there one night and never came back. None of us really believed those stories, but standing at the edge of the woods, I wasn't so sure anymore. The walk through the forest was unnerving. The trees loomed like silent watchers, their gnarled branches twisting in the darkness. The air was cold, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant hoot of an owl. After what felt like hours, we reached the cabin. It stood there, crumbling and overgrown, its windows shattered, and the door barely hanging on its hinges. The place reeked of abandonment, but something else too, something off. "Let's just take a quick look and get out," I whispered, not wanting to stay any longer than necessary. We stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath our feet. The interior was empty, save for a few pieces of broken furniture. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by our presence. For a moment, it seemed like nothing would happen, like the stories were just that, stories. And then we heard it. A faint rustling sound coming from the back of the cabin. "Did you hear that?" Carl whispered, his voice trembling. We all froze, listening. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from behind a door that led to the back room, a place none of us wanted to go. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of us. Slowly we approached the door, the creaking growing louder with each step. My heart was pounding in my chest, every instinct telling me to turn and run. Carl reached out and pushed the door open, revealing a dark, empty room. Except it wasn't empty. In the corner, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its body unnaturally elongated, like something out of a nightmare. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on us, cold and unblinking. None of us spoke. We just stared, frozen in place. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching us. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. We bolted, not waiting to see what it would do next. We ran through the woods, branches slapping at our faces, the figure's presence lingering behind us like a shadow. When we finally made it back to the house, we didn't say a word. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen, and we all knew we'd never go back into those woods again. My grandmother always had strange rules about her house, and none were stranger than her obsession with the mirror in the upstairs hallway. The mirror was ancient, its silver frame tarnished with age, and the glass always seemed cloudy, no matter how much you wiped it down. Grandma would never let anyone touch it, and she had one simple instruction: never look into the mirror after midnight. As a kid, I thought it was just an old lady's superstition, one of those quirky things she believed in. But as I grew older and spent more time in that house, I began to wonder if there was something more to it. One night, while staying with Grandma during the summer, I found myself wide awake after midnight. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. I had stayed up reading, and as I wandered into the hallway to get a glass of water, my eyes fell on the mirror. It looked normal at first, just my reflection staring back at me, but as I stood there, something shifted. The air grew cold, and the reflection changed. My reflection wasn't me anymore. It was still me, but something was off. The eyes in the mirror were too wide, the smile too forced. I blinked, shaking my head. When I looked again, everything seemed normal. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the curiosity gnawed at me. I wanted to test Grandma's rule, just to prove to myself that it was nothing more than a silly superstition. I waited until the old grandfather clock in the living room struck midnight. The house seemed to hold its breath as the chimes echoed through the hall. Heart pounding, I walked back to the mirror. This time, I could see the change almost instantly. The reflection's movements didn't match mine. It smiled, a wide, twisted grin, even though I wasn't smiling at all. My reflection's eyes darkened, almost black, and it slowly raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. I stumbled back, my heart racing. But the reflection didn't stop. It started to move, as if trying to climb out of the mirror, its twisted grin stretching wider and wider. I ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me, my pulse thundering in my ears. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told Grandma what had happened. She just nodded, her face grave, as if she'd been expecting it. "That mirror shows the other side," she said, her voice low and serious. "The side that doesn't belong here." She covered the mirror with a heavy cloth after that. We never spoke about it again, but every time I visited, I felt its presence, waiting just beyond that cloth, watching.